5 3 9 7 1 5.
Well, hello again, and welcome to this week's episode of Bigfoot for Breakfast, home of the mysterious and the macabre, where we sit in the studio every week challenging conventional thought. We are your hosts, Sarah Jones
and Samantha Carter.
It is October now, finally. I'm sure our listeners have guessed by now that we are pretty big fans of the Halloween season. We do want to take a short minute to give you a friendly reminder to please press the subscribe button on whichever podcast platform you happen to be listening from, and please leave a rating and a review. This helps out the show a lot, and we really appreciate reading what you guys think because that's what's important here, right? Also, if you have any desire to contact us about anything, really, show suggestions, corrections, opinions, anything, you can email us at bigfootforbreakfast@outlook.com. Leave us a message on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter, and you can leave us a voicemail that we will play on our next episode. If you want to do that, the number is 641-812-2635. We really love the voicemails that you guys leave, so keep them coming.
Also, we are looking for personal stories regarding anything, any type of subject that our podcast covers or hasn't covered yet.
Honestly, it can be anything that you've experienced paranormal, anything to do with cryptids, UFOs, UFO sightings, alien abductions, or really just anything of a creepy nature. We cover missing people.
Have you ever been kidnapped? Are you missing right now?
Yeah, let us know.
Call us. Talk to us about it.
We will try to help you.
I will come for you.
We will. Like Liam Neeson.
I have a very specific set of skills.
I don't.
None of them will help you, but I will try.
Yeah, our skills are not particularly useful in day-to-day life.
Now that we've gotten through all the serious stuff, let's get on to this week's episode because it's a good one. We're heading back to the root of our interest here at Bigfoot for Breakfast and diving into something that we've always had a ton of interest in, and hopefully you will too. The paranormal. This story has a lot of that, and as an added bonus, we get to talk about something else that we love here. Creepy American history. Specifically in America, we're going clear down to the deep south to a city rich with history, tradition, great food, which is super important to us, magical culture, and romantic mystery. And that city is none other than New Orleans. New Orleans.
So while the place that we are talking about has a lot of paranormal happenings, we don't get into that as much as we get into what we think may be the root of the paranormal happenings. So there's that. Once upon a time, there was a beautiful house filled with beautiful things in a beautiful city, and within this luxurious dwelling lived a manipulative and absolutely psychotic and murderous princess.
Hi, my name's Sam.
No, not like this.
I'm not even from New Orleans.
Good God. So today we'll be talking about both of these things. But first, the house. The huge Baroque-style mansion graced the corner of 1140 Royal Street in the French Quarter of bustling New Orleans, standing tall and grand with 2 stories, ceiling medallions, carved doors, carved wing angels, and many other beautiful details. The outside was embellished with large wrought iron balconies and Greek columns. Although the house was surrounded by other large and possibly equally as beautiful dwellings, this one quickly became one of the grandest and definitely one of the most popular places in the area.
The house was named after the woman who imagined it and brought it to life. She purchased the plot of land and oversaw the finishing of this dream home, done up just the way she wanted it. I say finishing because when she bought the property from a man named Edward de Fawcett in 1831, the building of a home had already begun there, but was left only partially complete. So she was left to finish it up her way. This wealthy young woman was Marie Delphine McCarthy Blanc LaLaurie. Madame LaLaurie came from money, and to her parents she was always known to be a gentle and very sweet daughter born to them in approximately 1780. She was born and raised right there in New Orleans, the second generation within her family to be born in America. She started out strong with a leg up in the world because her parents were very notable people in New Orleans. So she was basically born with a silver soup in her mouth.
She could have eaten soup with
her silver spoon.
The silver spoon.
So she was basically born with a silver spoon in her mouth and seemed to never want for much, if anything at all. They were upper class French Creole aristocratic socialites who got rich through various means, such as cotton, sugar cane, baking, making those king cakes. Well, it sounds like I'm saying baking, but I'm trying to say banking, but I have a cold and it sounds weird. And, believe it or not, the disgusting stain on the fabric of American history that is slave trading. When her parents died, she was only one of 2 children left to inherit their wealth, so she ended up in pretty good standing financially and socially.
So the first time that she married, she wed a man named Don Ramon de Lopez y Agulo, and he was a very high-ranking Spanish officer. They had a child together, and this child was reportedly born after his death while he was traveling by boat from Havana to Madrid. It was just Delphine and her child alone for about 4 years until she met another man and decided to give him her heart. This man's name was John Blanc. John was a banker, lawyer, and prominent slave trader as well. She married into even more money here, and he was also from New Orleans, and he came from a family that was about as equal in wealth and popularity as her own family was. And the couple had children also. They had 3 daughters and a son before this husband also passed away.
Delphine did marry yet again to her last husband, who was a lot younger than she was, and he was a doctor. His name was Leonard Louis Nicholas LaLaurie, but it doesn't sound like he was really around much, and Delphine was pretty much left alone to find things to do around the house and around town on her own.
See, I heard both ways. I heard it was pronounced Leonard, and then also Leonard, which sounds way more French. Leonard, like leotard, but with an N.
Leonard.
It looks like Leonard.
And it sounds like he wasn't even really very involved in her $33,750 property purchase at 1140 Royal Street. But although Delphine was left unaccompanied by her husband most of the time, she definitely made use of that time anyway. She was a total socialite and she made herself known around town. She was involved in a lot of different social activities with the many affluent people in her area, always out to impress. She would host huge, lavish parties that were really popular and well done with great food and live bands. Delphine LaLaurie was outwardly charming, sophisticated, and seemingly very kind. People really liked her. She seemed to really have it all: money, wealth, social standing, charm, and the love of her community for a while.
It's weird how people can seem so different in their outward appearances from who they are on the inside or how they act when they're not being seen. Don't believe everything you see on Facebook, folks.
Her house was well kept, and although she was a busy lady, this was made possible by the slaves that she kept in her household. Slave ownership during this time in Louisiana was in full swing and was really popular throughout the southern states, so this was not unusual. Everyone throughout the hierarchy of society owned slaves at this time, not even just the elite. So they were sold right at the dock and in the streets with little restriction. However, there were laws in place in Louisiana prohibiting the cruel mistreatment of slaves that had been so prevalent in early years. These laws were called the Black Codes, and from what we can read through them, they were more like a set of guidelines for how the slaves should act and how to deal with situations in which they would become unruly. So not really much for protection in any sense. There was a small paragraph that said, quote, "Slaves who shall not be properly fed, clad, and provided for by their masters may give information thereof to the Attorney General or the Superior Council or to all other officers of justice of an inferior jurisdiction, and may put the written exposition of their wrongs into their hands, upon which information, and even ex officio should the information come from another quarter, the Attorney General shall prosecute said masters."
So on the outside, in public, it appeared that Madame LaLaurie was on the up and up with these laws. Actually, a lot of people noticed that she was exceptionally kind to her slaves, and she even released 2 of them to freedom, one in 1819 and the other in 1832. She was so incredibly nice to them that it was unusual because, let's face it, people are crap, and often completely mistreated the people that they enslaved. Even if some of the slave owners weren't necessarily cruel, they certainly weren't nice. So it was unusual to see her be so overly sweet to people that she had enslaved and owned as her property. At one point, people who were close to Madame LaLaurie actually seemed to be catching on. A lot of people in town didn't really seem to buy the sweet Madame routine. It was so over the top that people really started to see through it, and they realized that it was more likely an act that she was putting on. The slaves who lived with her were also said to be haggard and malnourished in appearance.
As quoted from the book of Harriet Martineau, Retrospect of Western Travel, "But the lady was so graceful and accomplished, so charming in her manners, and so hospitable, that no one ventured openly to question her perfect goodness. If a murmur of doubt began among the Americans, the French resented it. If the French had occasional suspicions, they concealed them for the credit of their faction. Quote, "She was very pleasant to whites, I was told, and sometimes to blacks, but so broadly so as to excite suspicions of hypocrisy."
Rumors began to circulate that she wasn't nearly as nice as what she was portraying for the public eye. People really began to talk. There were even a few instances in which mistreatment of slaves within her household were witnessed by neighbors. A few of them saw her quick, violent outbursts toward them and toward her daughters as well. This typically would happen if they weren't quick enough to respond as soon as she snapped her fingers. Rumors about Madame LaLaurie were starting to move through the people of her area. Rumors of torture, beatings, and maybe even murder. They were saying that there was an old woman living in her house serving as her cook. This in itself wasn't unusual, but the fact that she was said to keep the 70-year-old lady chained to the stove certainly was. Others would tell stories that Madame LaLaurie kept people hidden in her house as slaves as well, that her husband would use as experimental subjects on which to practice voodoo medicine that he learned from Haiti. And if her daughters would try to intervene on behalf of the slaves, they would be whipped as well.
At one point, the rumors became so rampant and people were so convinced that there were evil things going on behind the closed doors of the LaLaurie mansion, a local attorney felt compelled to send his understudy to the home to visit just so he could get an idea of what may be going on. So the understudy went over to the house and spoke to her, asking her what was going on, to which she replied that nothing was going on and that no such abuse was occurring in her home. And it sounds like that was about it. He just believed her. He reported that he had found no evidence of abuse or mistreatment and that he considered Delphine LaLaurie to be quite charming. A woman named Harriet Martineau wrote a book called Retrospect of Western Travel, as we mentioned earlier. The book seems to be more of a journal of her travels through America as a French woman, but she mentioned the LaLaurie situation many times throughout the book and was close to it in a lot of ways. The lawyer who went to see Madame LaLaurie and let her off the hook was actually an understudy of a more prominent lawyer with whom Martineau was associated. In her book, she stated of this incident, quote, "The young man returned full of indignation against all who could suspect this amiable woman of doing anything wrong. He was confident that she could not harm a fly or give pain to any human being," end quote. But this didn't do much to quell the rumors.
And in defense of the people who were still talking behind the back of Delphine LaLaurie, in all accounts of this event in which the attorney visited the home, it truly sounds like he stepped in the front room, sipped some tea with the woman, found her simply freaking delightful, and politely bid her farewell. So either he really didn't care all that much if the rumors of her insane abuse and neglect were true, or he was intimidated by her high standing within society and her wealth, and he just decided not to dig too deep. For whatever reason, that he didn't do a complete investigation of her home, and we know that he didn't because he definitely would have noticed the significant horrors that lie only a few walls away from where he was pleasantly sitting in his rich people suit and rich people hat on his rich people couch sipping rich people tea, but he just didn't do it, which is disappointing, of course.
Only for those who aren't rich people.
Yeah, I believe that a lot of rich people would still feel this was horrific. I hope that's true.
I believe that is 100% true. Eventually, an actual event would prompt a second investigation into the household of Madame LaLaurie. A witness reported seeing someone, a child, jump or fall from the roof of LaLaurie house. Supposedly, the neighbor stated that she had seen the girl on the roof as well as Delphine. The girl was backing away from a whip-wielding Delphine LaLaurie and she misstepped, falling off of the roof to the street below. This would turn out to be a 12-year-old girl named Leah who had supposedly accidentally fallen from the roof of Madame LaLaurie's mansion. It would later come out that this poor child had been brushing Delphine's hair in her bedroom and she accidentally pulled a little too hard and Madame LaLaurie freaked out. The poor girl was whipped and she apparently knew that this was not the last of her punishment because she ended up getting away from LaLaurie and LaLaurie chased after her until the two of them reached the roof. There the girl stood outside on the roof with her tormentor standing in the only doorway with her whip. The girl must have realized that the punishment she would receive if Madame LaLaurie caught her and she ended up back in the house would be unbearable because she chose instead to jump from the roof of the building and little Leah was killed instantly.
So it sounds contradictory there, but I guess Madame LaLaurie's excuse was that she misstepped and fell, but the witness said that it looked like she jumped away from her. So I wanted to clear that up too. Witness accounts from the neighbor was obtained by Harriet Martineau because she wrote about this in her book as well, stating, quote, "She heard a piercing shriek from the next courtyard. She looked out and saw a little girl apparently about 8 years old," it turned out she was 12, "flying across the yard toward the house and Madame LaLaurie pursuing her, cowhide in hand. The lady saw the poor child run from story to story, her mistress following, till both came out on top of the house. Seeing the child about to spring over, the witness put her hands before her eyes. But she heard the fall, and she saw the child taken up, her body bending and limbs hanging as if every bone was broken. The lady watched for many hours, and at night, she saw the body brought out, a shallow hole dug by torchlight in the corner of the yard, and the corpse was covered over. No secret was made of what had been seen."
This atrocity didn't go unwitnessed, and this witness notified authorities. It seemed that LaLaurie had all kinds of excuses for what had happened here, and when she was witnessed burying the girl's body in the backyard, the police were alerted. They came down to talk to her, but since she was an affluent member of the community, they were reluctant to punish her. But there was actual evidence this time of wrongdoing. In the end, the police were forced to fine her $300, and LaLaurie was made to sell 9 of her slaves. This was probably the greatest news that these people could have ever gotten. But, do you want to hear something really unfair? They did make her sell them, but turned a blind eye when she bought them right back and brought them home. So, while they weren't going to be free upon the sale, they at least thought that they were going to be free from her incredible cruelty, and then they were told that they would be returning to her house pretty much immediately.
Delphine LaLaurie's neighbors had already been suspicious that she wasn't as sweet and kind as she liked to portray, and after the death of 12-year-old Leah, they were really not buying it anymore. They were pretty convinced that some awful things were going on in her home, and it wasn't merely a rumor. But of course, no one did anything about it.
There were even whispers that she beat her daughters as well because they would try to feed these starving people while she was out of the house. But Delphine had spies in the form of butlers and coachmen that would tell her about anything that happened in the house while she was away. She would pamper these men in order to keep them on her side and keep them telling her things.
On the evening of April 10th, 1834, neighbors began rushing to the house in droves because they could see that thick smoke was pouring from the windows and flames were leaping from the roof of the LaLaurie house. The house was engulfed. This happened during one of her lavish dinner parties, so the guests and all of her neighbors surrounded the house, offering water and trying to assist the family and the guests to evacuate the property, trying to save their lives. But when the neighbors got there, Madame LaLaurie and guests were already out, and she was alone, with no servants attending her except for just a couple who were serving people at the party. This was odd because at this time in America, the practice of slavery was pretty much in full swing, especially in the South. So a big house like this owned by a woman of wealth, not having numerous slaves within it, was kind of unheard of. So of course, now that Madame LaLaurie was noted to be outside of the house, and they saw her running around frantically, trying to retrieve as many expensive things that she could from the house, the neighbors hurried to ask her where the rest of the people were who lived within it. It sounds like she simply told them that the house was now empty. When the people seemed confused by this, because they knew that she had more slaves living within her house, she supposedly replied, "Never mind the servants. Save my valuables."
The firefighters and townspeople were able to enter the huge brick structure, and upon doing so, they found Madame LaLaurie's cook literally chained to the stove. They got the shackles off of the woman, and she told them that she started the fire on purpose for 2 reasons. First, to draw attention to her condition and hope that a large fire would cause the sadistic abuse within the household to be exposed, thus casting a light on who Delphine LaLaurie truly was. Second, to commit suicide because she had been told by Delphine that after the party, she was going to be taken upstairs and no one ever came back from going upstairs. Apparently, this poor woman preferred to burn to death rather than be tortured by Madame LaLaurie. Harriet Martineau wrote about this cook and her circumstances, stating, "It is a pity that some of the admiring guests whom she assembled around her hospitable table could not see through the floor and be made aware at what cost they were entertained."
The fact that she sounded so nonchalant about dismissing the fact that there were still people in the burning house when people were asking her about them could mean a couple of things. One, she was really convinced that she was so high in society that the things that firefighters and her neighbors were about to discover wouldn't really be that big of a deal, because she had used her wealth and position to get away with literally everything in her entire life. People might have talked behind her back, but they were never brave enough to venture deep enough into her life to find out what was really going on, because what they might find could lead to a confrontation that they did not want. 2, she figured that she was so high in society that they likely would just take her word that there was no one else in the house and they wouldn't go looking. Because even when she was questioned in the past, her charm kept investigators at bay every time. She was well known for hosting huge parties and get-togethers that everyone of note would attend. She was in the inner circle, and people likely didn't want to make her upset because they might be cast out of the inner circle. So she was probably surprised when they pressed on this time. Society had created an actual monster in so many ways.
Her abuse had gotten incredibly out of hand, and everyone was about to find out. We found a couple of writings in which people were questioning how she could even become this evil, and we think that the answer to that is likely way more simple than what so many people make of it. Psychologically. It seems like this is a girl who grew up getting pretty much anything she wanted. This continued throughout her life because she had her family's wealth and status to lean on. She kept slaves because it was a form of status. It showed that you were wealthy and in good social standing. How she looked to society was important. She never had to do anything for herself and had a community full of people who never questioned her, never took anything away from her, never punished her, even though they didn't really like her or what they thought she was doing. So then she had control of this small group of people that were enslaved to her. It probably started out minor, doing little things to them physically as a form of punishment, and then she found out that she enjoyed it. They didn't do something exactly like she wanted, and she liked seeing the little ways in which she could make them suffer. Then she took it a step further, and her abuse turned into torture, and the more she did it, the worse she got. And the fact that she kept getting away with it, the less human these people seemed to her, and it became just part of her routine. She was simply an unchecked psychopath with easily attainable human victims completely at her disposal.
You're listening to the Prescribed Films Podcast Network, home to hundreds of hours of free podcast entertainment. The shows on this network all have a common goal, providing you with the best discussions about movies and other forms of entertainment media. The PFPN hopes to fill your earholes with audio joy. Visit our website with links to all the other amazing shows at www.thepfpn.com. Thanks for listening.
So back to this fire. We bet you're wondering what they found in her house. Well, only part of the house had been destroyed, but surprisingly, a lot of it was still intact. Neighbors walked around inside, looking around and searching the house for anyone who might still be alive and possibly savable. Initially, they just kind of walked around the first floor and seemed to find nothing except for smoke-damaged walls and destroyed belongings. They made their way up to the second floor, essentially finding the same thing, a whole lot of nothing. For a minute, they thought that maybe no one else did live in the home with Madame LaLaurie. But then, the group of searchers came across an obscure, locked room on the second floor of the house. When they asked Delphine for the keys, she refused to give them up. So the men decided to break down the door. What they would find here would change their view of the sweet, cultured, respectable woman they all knew forever, and brand Marie Delphine LaLaurie forever as the savage mistress of New Orleans for decades to come, stripping her beloved status away from her and reducing her name to less than nothing.
Witnesses reported 7 people in that room. In an article from the April 11th, 1834 New Orleans Bee reported that the event and what witnesses described. The article reads, quote, "The conflagration at the house occupied by the woman LaLaurie on Hospital Street is like discovering one of those atrocities the details of which seem to be too incredible for human belief. We would shrink from the task of detailing the painful circumstances connected herewith, were it not that a sense of duty and the necessity of exposing and holding to the public indignation such a wretch as the perpetrator renders it indispensable for us to do so. The flames having spread with an alarming rapidity, and the horrible suspicion being entertained among the spectators that some of the inmates of the premises where it originated were incarcerated therein, the doors were forced open for the purpose of liberating them. Previous, however, to taking this liberty, if liberty it can be called, several gentlemen, impelled by their feelings of humanity, demanded the keys, which were refused them in a gross, insulting manner. Upon entering one of the apartments, the most appalling spectacle met their eyes. 7 slaves, more or less horribly mutilated, were seen suspended by the neck with their limbs apparently stretched and torn from one extremity to the other. Language is powerless and inadequate to give a proper conception of the horror which a scene like this must have inspired. We shall not attempt it, but leave it rather to the reader's imagination to picture what it was. The slaves were the property of the demon in the shape of a woman who we mentioned in the beginning of this article. They had been confined by her for several months in the situation from which they had thus providentially been rescued, and had been merely kept in existence to prolong their suffering and to make them taste all that the most refined cruelty could inflict. But why dwell upon such aggravating and painful particulars? We feel confident that the community share with us our indignation that vengeance will fall heavily upon the guilty culprit. Without being superstitious, we cannot but regard the manner in which these atrocities have been brought to light as an especial interposition of heaven.
A local judge showed up at the scene of the fire and saw all of the horror and chaos that ensued from these findings. He briefly spoke with Delphine LaLaurie and her husband, and they told him that he shouldn't have bothered to come, as if it was no big deal. Her husband specifically said, quote, "Some people had better stay at home rather than come to others' houses to dictate laws and meddle with other people's business." He was quoted as stating that what the searchers had found in the house was the kind of slave abuse that was never before seen. It was psychotic abuse.
To add insult to injury, the slaves, many of them in horrible, horrible condition, were taken down to the jailhouse and put in cells where they would be available for public viewing. It was reported that the purpose of this was to allow people to see what they had suffered, and as proof that they had endured these atrocities at the hands of the good Madame LaLaurie. In another article of the New Orleans Bee, they reported on this. Part of the article reads, quote, "The whole of yesterday and the preceding today and the preceding day, the police jail was crowded by persons pressing forward to witness the unfortunate wretches who had escaped cruelties that would compare with those of a Domitian, a Nero, or a Caligula. 4,000 persons at least, it is computed, have already visited these victims to convince themselves of their sufferings." End quote. Supposedly, the newspaper even showed a photo of these poor people in the jail, which we didn't even bother to search for because it's just horrible that their photo was in the paper this way.
Later on, the slaves and eyewitnesses told their story directly. It wasn't unusual to hear tales of men being chained to walls, their penises cut off, eyes removed, and fingernails pulled from their fingers. Others had been skinned and were still alive. One man's mouth had been stuffed full of feces and then subsequently sewn shut. One person's appendages had been sewn onto another. Another man's intestines had been pulled from an open cut to his abdomen and wrapped around his waist like a belt. Some people were found alive like this. Some had been long deceased. Holes in skulls through which she stirred their brains with a wooden spoon that sat on a nearby table. Maggot-filled horrible wounds. People hanging from the rafters. Actively bleeding welts.
In an article from the New Orleans Bee, proprietor Jerome Bayon wrote, "We saw where the collar and manacles had cut their way into the quivering flesh. For several months they had been confined in those dismal dungeons, with no other nutrition than a handful of gruel and insufficient quantities of water, suffering the tortures of the damned and longingly awaiting death as a relief to their suffering. We saw Judge Canonge and others making some fruitless efforts to rescue those poor unfortunates whom the infamous woman LaLaurie had doomed to certain death, and hoped that devouring element might thus obliterate the last traces of her nefarious deeds."
Nefarious, Sam.
Nefarious.
We've had this argument before.
Scenario, nefario.
No.
Nefarious.
We had talked about her standing in society, allowing her to get away with a lot of things, and it's likely that people in town knew that she was abusive, but maybe didn't realize it was to this extent. Not that she should have been able to get away with any form of abuse, but likely they didn't really expect to find this.
One of the eyewitnesses said that one woman's arms had been removed and the wounds sewn up, and then her skin was peeled off in a circular pattern so that she would look like a caterpillar. Another woman had had her bones broken and reset several times over the course of who knows how long, and by the time she was found, she walked like a human crab. Who knows how long these people had been up there, witnessing these atrocities and enduring them. People were found wearing spiked collars and covered in honey. It turns out that she would cover these people in honey and then release a mess of black ants into the cell. There were bottles of blood in the attic as well, supposedly having been drained from these poor people. There was no possible way that the public could ignore this. A blind eye could not be turned. And it doesn't sound like they even wanted to. The crowd which had discovered this room of hers was absolutely enraged. The evidence was undeniable. She couldn't write this off as an accident. There was no excuse to be given at this point. She was evil, and only she could be responsible for the condition of her hostages.
Harriet Martineau's account of this was similar in her book, but she also added, quote, "The cowhide stiff with blood hung against the wall, and there was a stepladder on which this fiend stood while flogging her victims, in order to lay on the lashes with more effect. Every morning it was her first employment after breakfast to lock herself in with her captives and flog them, until her strength failed. Amid shouts and groans, the sufferers were brought out into the air and the light. Food was given to them with too much haste, for 2 of them died in the course of the day. The rest, maimed and helpless, are pensioners of the city."
The living slaves were released from the attic, but it wasn't over. Word about what had been found in the attic of the LaLaurie house quickly spread among onlookers and throughout the area, and people were angry. They were horrified. The townspeople formed an ungovernable mob and rushed the home. There was nothing the police could really do about it. They ransacked it, smashed windows, tore off doors, and threw her expensive belongings out into the street to be shattered. The streets in front of her house were littered with debris. Historian Castellanos stated, quote, "As crash succeeded crash, yells of delight rent the air. When Royal and Hospital streets became obstructed with the accumulating wrecks, the latter were heaped together and set on fire." End quote. People remembered a soft walk down the street due to the ridiculous amounts of feathers on the ground after all of the down mattresses and pillows had been ripped apart and thrown out. They completely destroyed the place until the exterior shell of the place was the only thing standing, just a skeleton of a place that needed to be forgotten.
This discovery and level of abuse was absolutely horrifying. But what's even more horrifying and totally inexcusable is that during all of this chaos, the arguments, rioting, and destruction at the house after the discovery, some freaking how, Delphine LaLaurie and her carriage driver, Bastine, just scooted away. By the time anyone realized that the 2 of them were not around, they were long gone. Supposedly, they were thought to have gone to the port with their horse and carriage and then caught a ship to Paris. One of our sources states that there was, however, no record of her ever having made it to Paris. We're guessing that she may have simply changed her name because likely that wouldn't have been too hard during the 1800s, really. Her daughter did remain in New Orleans, and she had told people that she was receiving letters from her, but she didn't actually seem to have shown anyone the letters because no one really knew what they said.
After the fire settled down and Madame LaLaurie escaped, there was nothing left but the smoldering remains of the house, and investigators left scratching their heads. Thorough investigation of the property happened at this time, of course, and more horrors were discovered. Several more bodies were found. So this woman had been murdering people living within her house for years, and little Leah would have ended up being just another one of them had the neighbors not actually seen her fall off that roof. Beyond that, the authorities dug out a well and found even more bodies, including that of a small child whose bones had been badly broken.
Years and years later, in the late 1930s, a weird thing happened. A man named Eugene Bax was working as a caretaker in the St. Louis Cemetery, and in Alley 4 of Cemetery Number 1, he noticed something that was out of place. A copper plate had been placed and fixed in the New Orleans St. Louis Cemetery. On the copper plate, a name was carved, and it read, quote, LaLaurie, Madame Delphine McCarty. There was an additional inscription, but it was written in French. It was translated as saying, Mrs. Marie LaLaurie, born Delphine McCarty LaLaurie, died in Paris on December 7th, 1842 at age 67. The plate sounds like it was placed here kind of randomly, as in it wasn't attached to a tomb or a grave or anything. Some say that this points to the fact, though, that she likely did stay around the area and that maybe she was buried there. But who knows if this is even true, because later investigators did find some evidence that Madame LaLaurie had passed away, but in 1849 in Paris. But many people don't believe any of that. It's widely speculated in the area that Madame LaLaurie did flee to Paris initially, but that she returned not long after and resumed life in New Orleans under a new name. Other rumors speculate that she died in December of 1842 from wounds sustained from a boar while she was hunting. There was talk of her having settled quietly in Maidville or Covington, Louisiana, and then quietly died there. She has never been found or discovered, and no one really knows for sure whatever happened to her. All we know is it's a terrifying thing that this woman was allowed to escape and resume her life and possibly all of her vices anywhere else in the world. So once again in her life, she just got away with what she had done.
So why would she have done this? Obviously, there's a lot of psychological speculation to unpack here. A theory that we thought sounded pretty reasonable was that it was simply about power. The wealth and status of her family had allowed her to have whatever she wanted. She had power. People did what she said. But there was something going on in this area of the good old US of A that may have contributed to the start of these actions as well as their long-term continuance. Just before this time period, New Orleans was a French city, but during the time that Madame LaLaurie would have been horrifically torturing people in her upstairs room of death, there was somewhat of a political power struggle going on. The Louisiana Purchase happened in 1803, and it made this part of the land an active part of the United States, and this brought a whole bunch of American people.
The Americans set up a port, which brought many other different types of immigrants here and made the slave trade even more popular in the area because they could be brought in right there through New Orleans. The French Creole people supposedly had somewhat of a rough time assimilating to American culture, and the Americans didn't really care for them too much. The French Creoles didn't want all of this change necessarily, and their status was declining. This mixing of people brought the French Creole society down a notch basically just because they weren't Americanizing enough, and there was another larger group of people present in the area to look down their nose at them. They were two leading societies with something to prove, and it was a constant struggle for the upper hand. With the amount of power that Delphine LaLaurie had been raised with, she probably didn't like this natural slight decline in society and took it out on her slaves. The abuse gave her that little boost of power and control that she was craving, and they were easy to take advantage of because she was more believable as a white woman, and this is what allowed her to get away with this for so long.
Other people, such as historian Henry Castellanos, stated that she had a duplex nature that allowed her to feel genuine sorrow at the thought of the suffering of others. She volunteered for charities and genuinely helped many people, including people of color. Many of her slaves lived with her and seemed to feel genuinely warm devotion to her, and they had genuinely good relationships with her. But on the opposite end of the spectrum, she was able and willing to inflict massive amounts of torture and suffering onto others. He contends that it didn't necessarily seem to be an issue of true racism against the African American population, but more a mental health issue in which she had an insatiable urge to inflict great harm on people who she perceived had wronged her in some way. Even if that wrongdoing was slight or unintentional, she would take it to the extreme. There was no such thing as a light punishment for her. If she felt wronged, they deserved a fate worse than death. And that is what several of them got. The people of color that she took ownership of would be the most likely to actually end up suffering at the hands of Madame LaLaurie. If she felt that someone out in society had wronged her, she wouldn't necessarily have been able to do anything about it because it would be much more noticeable, and she wanted to keep up her kind and gentle appearance. But it wouldn't be so noticeable if a few of her slaves living within her home were suddenly gone. It's tough to say whether or not Castellanos' argument that Delphine LaLaurie wasn't acting out of ill feeling towards people of color, because we used his writing about this issue in his historical book, and he seems like he enjoyed slavery quite a lot, judging from these writings. So he isn't necessarily a neutral judge here, and may have just been making excuses for her.
We also have to take into consideration the fact that the rumors really seem to have gotten started after she moved into this house and had been married to her much younger doctor husband. Within a year before the fire, she had taken her husband to court and accused him of severe spousal abuse. Now, my first thought when I read that was maybe he was the one doing the abusing and torturing of all of these people. But we really don't think that is the case because every single account names her as the culprit, and we really can only assume that this is because the victims told the authorities that it was her who was doing it. Nowhere did we read that her husband was actually doing the torturing, even though there was a lot of speculation that he may have been somewhat involved, or at the very least, he knew about it. After they went to court, the couple separated, but not really. It was one of those separations where the guy kind of still lives there and stays there, so it doesn't sound like it was a total separation by any means. The idea here is that if he was abusing her, and this was the first time she had ever felt powerlessly mistreated in this way, did she take it out on her slaves in a shit runs downhill type of situation?
But also you could speculate that if she was experiencing severe spousal abuse, maybe she had head trauma, which damaged her frontal lobe, which affected her impulse control. And that is linked quite frequently with violent behavior.
Yeah, maybe. It's hard to speculate on why someone would do something like this.
Yeah. Another historian by the name of Adolph Roberts made the conclusion that Delphine LaLaurie was simply a sadist. She took pleasure from the act of inflicting pain onto others, period. Obviously, we don't have a lot of answers as to why she did the things that she did. And as much as we dug around, the records on these incidents back in the mid-1800s weren't super in-depth. Mostly, we found a lot of speculation from people mildly associated with the people involved, newspaper articles, and historical analysis type articles. It would have been really great to have had a good psychiatrist evaluate and assess her at this time and have record of that, but alas, we do not. It would have also been great to have found victim statements of some sort, but there was none of that either. So we did the best we could with what we had and hope we didn't leave too many loose ends.
There is actually another point that I read that I thought was interesting. When we had first read about this story and how the angry firefighters and neighbors in this area stormed the house and destroyed it out of anger and disdain, I assumed it was because they felt a huge amount of sorrow and sympathy for the people that they had found in that room. And it gave me a tiny little glimmer of hope for humanity. But the argument that I read was in an article called The Radical Impact of Madame Delphine LaLaurie on Slavery and the Image of African Americans. And this was written by Sophie Raylander, and it was submitted to the Young Historians Conference. She said that their sympathy had nothing to do with it, really. She submitted that the Southern slave owners were angry about the fact that she had exposed the treatment of slaves to such an extent that it would give abolitionists more fuel for their fire, and that this could be used as a strong case for emancipators to force the South into forfeiting their slave-owning rights. The idea of reform was already in the works, and these people did not like it.
The house was officially restored in 1838 by a man named Pierre Trestor in the Empire style and served as an integrated school at this time. How ironic.
Ha ha, madam.
Madam.
Later during the 1800s, it was a conservatory of music.
In 1892, the body of an eccentric upper-class man named Joseph Edouard Vignier was found dead in the attic of the home. He had been living there for a short time after the home was passed on to him.
In her book, Martineau also reported in a witness statement, quote, "Workmen employed to repair the old cypress floors began digging up human skeletons from under the house. So it all simmered down to one conclusion. They were bodies of the LaLaurie slaves, buried thus in order that their manner of death should not become known." So Martineau had talked to a few other people who had lived within the house years later. This was in the early 1900s, years after Madame LaLaurie had been gone.
From 1923 to 1932, it was the Warrington House for Indigent Men, and there were several ghostly encounters encountered during this time period. One man supposedly woke in the middle of the night being choked by an apparition dressed in clothes from the early 1800s. He was panicking, understandably, but out of nowhere, literally, another apparition appeared and knocked the one who was choking him to the floor. At that point, the two apparitions rolled around the room, fighting one another until they rolled into a dark corner and never emerged.
That'd be enough for me to be done with that. Another resident stated that he saw the apparition of a man who was walking around carrying his own head in his hands. Yet another resident described seeing a large black man on the stairs, and this man was wrapped in chains. As he descended the stairway and as he reached the very last step, He just disappeared.
After the closing of the Warrington House, the building was sold again in 1932 to the Grand Consistory of Louisiana, which is a branch of the Scottish Rite Freemasonry. After that, in 1945, a man bought the house, and being fully aware of and excited about the hauntings going on there, he kept a written record of everything that was experienced by his patrons in their time there.
So that man that bought the house and kept the records, he actually turned it into a bar. And so when people would report things, he would hurry up and write it down. So he had this big list, like in a notebook, which sounds reasonable. During the 50s, the house was converted into a furniture store. One morning, the store owner showed up to open his store as usual, and to his surprise, he found that all of the furniture in the place was completely ruined. Every piece was covered in this thick, nasty liquid, and he had to get rid of all of it. Of course, he didn't really think that ghosts had done this. He actually thought that it was more likely to be teenagers or vandals, and they had broken in and destroyed the merchandise. So he had a plan. He waited there one night, all night, with his furniture and a shotgun. No one showed up, but then when the sun began to rise and the first light peeked into the building, he could see that again, everything in the store was covered in the same crap. Obviously, he couldn't afford to keep dealing with that, so he closed his store and moved on.
An artist by the name of Zelia Funk bought the LaLaurie house in 1969. At one point, she did an interview with a local paper where she talks about having seen a man, calling him a romantic figure. She saw him in front of a full-length mirror, and she watched him for several minutes, and then he faded away. She described his physical appearance, as well as stating that he was about 5'9", about 170 pounds, and had a red beard. He was wearing a cream-colored hat. She described further happenings as well, and that usually these things happened while she was sitting by the window. This is where Mr. LaLaurie sat at his desk.
You can take haunted tours around New Orleans now, and the LaLaurie Mansion is on that list of places that they will take you. These days, though, it's privately owned, so you have to stand outside of the home while on tour. But for a while, the tour guides could take people in. Many reported strange happenings while on such tours, such as lights blinking on and off and screaming coming from other rooms and down the corridors. A tour guide named Whitney wrote on an Uber blog about the LaLaurie Mansion that an entire group experienced these exact things, as well as seeing a woman dressed from the 1800s walking around upstairs.
Historian Henry Castellanos didn't necessarily seem to believe that the LaLaurie house was haunted by spirits, but he did believe in something there because he stated in his book, quote, "No spirits wander through its wide halls and open corridors, but in lieu thereof there rests a curse, a malediction, that follows everyone who has ever attempted to make it a permanent habitation."
If you've ever heard of the LaLaurie Mansion before, it's likely you heard about it because it's said to be one of the most haunted places in America. It didn't take very long after the fire destroyed the house and revealed the insane evil that had been taking place inside for the ghost stories to start going absolutely crazy. Between the real-life horror and the subsequent paranormal history, the LaLaurie house was forever cemented into the galleys of New Orleans culture and history.
Fun fact, the LaLaurie house and her initial evil owner, Madame LaLaurie, were featured in a season of American Horror Story, although most of the filming actually took place down the street at the Herman Grimo house.
And it was wildly inaccurate.
There was a crab man.
Yeah, they used her character well, but I think that they intermingled two characters because I never read that Madame LaLaurie put the blood of her victims on her face to make herself younger. Who was that? I think that they were mixing up Madame LaLaurie and Elizabeth Bathory. Maybe not mixing them up, but kind of combining the cultural tales, you know, because they had Delphine LaLaurie sitting at her table at the beginning, putting blood on her face to make herself younger.
But I mean, they may have, obviously they dramatized it.
Oh yeah. I'm not criticizing their depiction. I'm just saying if you watch it, there's some mix up.
I don't know. They might have just taken elements of it just, you know, to make it a more interesting story.
And I like the dynamic that they used between Delphine LaLaurie and Marie Laveau and the battle of witchy wits.
I just really like Kathy Bates.
Kathy Bates is awesome. And she made Delphine LaLaurie look like an evil bitch. That she was. Fun fact part 2. Nicolas Cage bought the mansion in 2007, but he didn't own it for very long because the bank foreclosed on it in 2009. In the Ghost City Tours article where we read this information, they said, quote, "It's true that he managed his money as well as he acts and no longer owns the house."
Shut your mouth. I love Nicolas Cage.
I know. So I was going to go on to say, there is no author name attached to this particular article, but those, sir, are fighting words.
Yeah, you can't attach your name to it because you know you're wrong.
And we challenge you to back that stuff up because Nicolas Cage is awesome. I mean, Con Air. What's your problem?
What's your problem?
It's like that time that Russell Crowe put down Kevin Costner.
I didn't like Russell Crowe as...
Yeah, he was horrible. He wasn't even a good Robin Hood, and Kevin Costner's Robin Hood was fabulous. So
My significant other also hates Nicolas Cage. We fight about it all the time.
Nicolas Cage is fantastic. I can't figure it out.
I'm getting a cardboard cutout and putting it in my house.
Yep.
Next to Pennywise. So, a not so fun fact, despite the vast majority of people from around the New Orleans area and beyond were never in doubt of her wrongdoings and guilt, there were affluent people back then who stood in support of Delphine LaLaurie. The president of the board of curators of the Louisiana State Museum at one time stated, quote, "I have always thought that Madame LaLaurie was the first victim of yellow journalism. There is nothing in the record to indicate that she was the type of woman pictured by them. One must remember that there was much social jealousy in those days and that Madame LaLaurie occupied an enviable position socially." End quote. He claimed to have based his opinion mainly on the fact that, like we said earlier, she had emancipated 2 of her slaves. There is record that she had done this, and we had never really found a good record of why she did this, but it certainly doesn't negate the fact that these people were found having been tortured to this extent in her home, and the fact that they told authorities that it was her who had done it. But that begs the question to me, did she emancipate them, or did she pretend to emancipate them and then they were just gone?
Yeah, no, that is totally legitimate, cuz
like at first maybe she had attempted to cover it up.
Maybe, I don't know. That's really true, because I couldn't find any record of an actual emancipation, and there really wasn't any elaboration on those 2 situations. It just said that she had emancipated them. So she probably just killed those people and then told her neighbors, who wondered where they went, that she set them free. And that, Bigfoot for Breakfast friends, is the terrible tale of the building of a beautiful dream home, the horrors that took place inside of it, and its final destruction at the hands of vengeful and astounded townspeople who accidentally discovered those horrors. The existence of Madame LaLaurie has gone down in history as one of god-awful cruelty to innocent and basically helpless people who are forced to live under her thumb, and that is a sad, sad legacy for people to leave behind. Please join us next week for another episode of Bigfoot for Breakfast. Don't forget to subscribe to our show so that you can be notified every week of a new episode, and please feel free to contact us and let us know how you think we are doing. We absolutely love to hear from you. Until next week, au revoir. Right? Is that how you say goodbye in French?
Au revoir? I think so.
Get out of here.
Come at me, bro.